Hello, my name is Beryl Scott, and I am the president of the Canadian Multicultural Education Foundation, or as we call ourselves, CMEF. I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are located on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional lands of First Nations and Métis. Edmonton is and has been home to diverse Indigenous nations and peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Sultano, Anishinaabe, Tusuna, Inuit, and many others. They have called these lands home since time immemorial. As a multicultural organization, CMEF acknowledges the Treaty 6 land and territories of our First Nations. This is a reminder to us to continue learning about Indigenous communities, creating meaningful relationships with them, and promoting recognition of their history, languages, and traditions. This is our commitment to action. The Canadian Multicultural Education Foundation is a not-for-profit organization founded in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada on October 1st, 1990. Our mandate is to strengthen the multicultural fabric of Canada through educational and community programs. I am proud to say that CMEF has steadfastly developed and offered innovative programs in response to emergency needs and realities. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce the New Horizons Seniors Project, featuring videos developed and produced collaboratively during the COVID-19 pandemic by an intergenerational and multicultural team of seniors and youth for seniors and youth. This project has been made possible by the support of the Government of Canada's New Horizons for Seniors program.
We acknowledge that the traditional land on which we reside is in Treaty 6 territory, where diverse Indigenous people have marked their footsteps on these traditional lands for centuries. We are grateful for the land we are using and respect the languages, cultures, and histories of the diverse Indigenous people of Canada. And then, Donna, would you like to introduce the guests?
Oh, yes. Our guests today are Lewis Cardinal and his son Hunter Cardinal. Lewis is a member of the Sucker Cree Nation and is the project manager of the Indigenous Knowledge and Wisdom Center. He is a well-known Edmonton community leader. And Hunter Cardinal is a member of the Sucker Cree Nation, a performer and a consultant in diversity and equity. Is that sufficient? Would you like us to add anything else?
Oh no, I think that's wonderful.
Thank you. Singers in the Cardinal Band.
Yes, we are very pleased that you have agreed to assist us in this presentation and to allow us to interview you.
Okay, thank you.
So Crystal, back to you.
Mm-hmm. We are making a series of videos for older adults. One of the questions that older adults think about is, how have I done in passing on my culture to my children and grandchildren? So to start off with the questions, Lewis, how are you transferring your Cree knowledge and cultural practices to your children and to your community?
Well, I think one of the key ways that I've presented our traditional knowledge and our heritage knowledge and our cultural knowledge, I guess you can say, is by the use of story and storytelling. And I think that it's been a very effective way to provide that sort of information. And so I think that when we tell and share a story, that it resonates more into a person's being. One of the traditions that I believe in, or one of the knowledges that I've learned, is that if you want to help change and to transfer something, that you move the heart, and then the mind will follow. And I think that when we do storytelling, we speak to the heart, and then the mind then holds on to that knowledge that's locked within those stories or those traditions.
So just on the side, I know you're coordinator of the Indigenous Knowledge and Wisdom Center. Is storytelling a part of the goal of the center when it's completed?
Yeah, the Indigenous Knowledge and Wisdom Center is an organization that was started by the Alberta Chiefs about 6-7 years ago. And one of the projects that the IKWC picked up was a project called Kichiaski, Sacred Land. And so that's what I'm the project manager of. And that is Canada's first urban Indigenous cultural and ceremonial land space designated specifically for ceremonial purposes. And we are hoping to inspire other cities to set aside land for that as well, for their Indigenous citizens. And so a part of what Indigenous Knowledge and Wisdom does is really compiling history and stories of our Indigenous knowledge so that we can develop curriculum, projects, and even policy development to support Indigenous schools, but also to support resources, much needed resources to the public and separate school systems as well. And that's always locked within the stories that we tell.
Mm-hmm. We may want to ask you more about the center later on, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Hunter, what challenges have you experienced in acquiring your culture from your parents and your grandparents and your community?
I think that some of the most important challenges you can overcome when engaging with your culture is being able to see yourself in it. And this is something that I think I've been really fortunate to have a lot of support from my family, from my dad especially, of, when you're telling these stories, when you're talking about culture, it's not separate from you. It is who you are. And, and I think that that's a really important thing, because we can have a tendency to, put a capital C for culture, where it becomes this thing. Stories has a capital S, and it's something that is outside of us, but really it's not. It's quite simple. It's reminders of, who we are, who we came from, but also it's dreams about, who we can be. Yeah. So I think it's really powerful to be able to see yourself. And I think that, circling back to the question that you asked my dad earlier, ultimately what we're doing is I believe, behavioral change when it comes to the transmission of culture. And, the literature on behavior change is very clear. Any change that you wish to make in terms of, actions that are sustainable, that become part of your individual self, if it's not in alignment with who you think you are, those behaviors won't last. So I think always trying to find a way where you can see yourself in the culture, and then expanding it too, if you don't, is crucial. There's so many wonderful conversations happening right now with diversities of sexuality, gender, relationships to culture. I mean, my dad and I, we have different experiences because of the generational gap, and I think that's wonderful. So always making sure that it's a way that brings you into balance with, the most important things that help you live a good life. I think that's going to be the ongoing challenge.
Yeah, and I just want to add to that by saying that, and Hunter is the one who had presented this knowledge, is that a part of that storytelling, when we look back in our history as Indigenous people, we have these creation stories. And I'm going to put you on the spot, Hunter, because as I transfer these stories to Hunter, I'm also adding my own experience and adding to that story. And so that story continues to move forward. Now, offering these stories to my son, he then, because of his own context, reality, and experience and knowledge, he then is adding to that himself, so that when he's ready, he'll be able to move that to his children.
I see. Yeah. So that's a transfer from one generation to the next, and and we're able to add so much context, as you say, because of our lived experiences. Yes.
Mhm.
Yes. Crystal?
I quite like that actually. I think it's actually really good that the story moves with you. So it
Yes.
adds on to it. I quite like that. So Hunter, as an actor and as a consultant, your profession is transferring culture to both your own people and to the broader community. Can you tell us a little bit about your work?
Yeah, so what we do is we offer Indigenous-based solutions to help with organizations and individuals that are working towards their diversity and inclusion goals. And so really what we're doing is we're doing this approach through using language and storytelling, and more specifically, because Indigenous peoples are a very diverse group of communities, the Nihiwewen or the Cree people, our ancestors and our communities today, we're using that language in those stories. And the reason why we do that is because stories are not just window dressing, they're not just nice little narratives, but they're key to creating communities that will rally together when times get tough, as opposed to communities that are shallowly moored and scattered when those troubles arise. So what we do is we essentially provide Indigenous awareness training through that storytelling lens of being able to really look at the larger story that we're connected to as Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, so that we can understand our place, as well as the gifts and opportunities that we have in this larger relationship and this larger story. For me, it feels like, on a day-to-day level, when I'm providing these educational sessions, it's just all of us gathering together and really reminding ourselves of the plot. Because I think it's very easy for us to, given everything that's happening and all the compounding social changes that we're going through due to COVID, we can lose ourselves in where we are, where we're going, where we came from. But returning to what we know to be true, like concepts of Indigenous treaty making and being in a relationship, that's kind of what we're doing. So that's what I do. It's a lot of nerding out about very specific things, as well as a lot of translation work as well. And I think that one of the most exciting things is, even though we're having conversations about diversity and inclusion, relationship, and so on, we actually, as Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, struggle to communicate because we're relating to those ideas from entirely different worldviews. So really what this is it's pausing to just make sure that we're providing folks with the ability to switch between, a Western way of looking at things and an Indigenous way, and understand that there's a difference there, so that we can create that understanding. And if you understand, then you know what to do.
So just let me ask you, you mentioned translation. Are you involved in any translation?
Yeah.
How is that working? Or
what I mean by translation,
what are you translating?
Yeah, we're translating ideas. When we talk about
Okay.
relationships, each one of us, from our diverse backgrounds and positions in this larger circle of life, we're not going to be able to necessarily say what each other have said. We can only say what we heard. So what this is about is sort of translating that. When, my father and I, when we're talking about treaty, we're not talking about the Western concepts of treaty that, we'd be familiar with in terms of like the Treaty of Versailles or Westphalia. We're talking about Indigenous relationship processes, which are entirely different. So giving folks the opportunity to be like, hey, even though, let's say, we're talking about this pen, you can only see this side, but you can't see what I see. So we're allowing people the opportunity to translate, to understand what each and every one of us are seeing in that sort of circle of understanding. So I hope that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Did you want to add something, Lewis? I see you nodding.
Well, I agree, because it's just for me quite the honor and the treat to hear how Hunter is translating those things and what he's bringing to that history and to that knowledge. If you look behind me, you'll see a bunch of pictures. And these pictures of my relatives who have lived before me, who've done amazing things. And each one of those pictures has a story to tell about struggle, about success, about making positive changes in the world. And so for me, when we transfer knowledge vis-a-vis stories or histories, it's really bringing those stories into a new light, into another generation to see them, because each generation needs to add to what we already know. So in so many ways, I present to them what we call as a bundle, a sacred bundle that has medicine in it. So that's a metaphor of what I'm passing and what I've passed on to Hunter. Then he will take that and he will open it and he will share those stories that are there, but then he will also add something into it as well. So each of our generations are adding to it, so that the folks behind me remind me of that in terms of what am I adding to that story, so that other generations after me can benefit from that knowledge and also become a part of that knowledge as well.
Did you want me to go? Go ahead, Crystal. Or
No, it's good. You can go ahead.
okay, thank you. So why do you think it's important to share this knowledge and your cultural practices between generations?
Well,
Both of
I
you
think
could
we all
address
know. Yeah, okay, I'll go first, and then Hunter can
Yeah.
follow. He always finishes it off really well. So, what I know about stories and what I know about culture is that the power behind them is so life affirming. It's so connecting you to something greater than yourself. So, for example, these individuals behind me on the wall have participated in ceremonies that have been in existence for thousands of years, or eons, if you will. And for me to know that if I do a smudging ceremony, that I'm actually participating in something that my ancestors have done since time immemorial. And it places me in front of a very long line of relatives. And in that way, psychologically, it tells me that I am not alone and that my relatives are with me. And through ceremonies that we do, it's the same thing as well, is that we are practicing something. The foundation of ceremonies don't change,
Yes.
but we do also add to them as well, because each generation needs to define for itself new ceremonies to meet the challenges of their day. So when we do ceremony, or when we tell story as well, we are connecting ourselves to that greater sense of who we are. And that's why the transfer of culture is really important. It's not as rigidly fixed as we think, because we know that if a culture does not meet the challenges of the day by changing the metaphors of those stories and those cultures to meet the challenges, it's those cultures that die. But if we take those ceremonies and the cultural practices and then add to them, then the culture lives.
Yeah. And I would add too, like, we have such a strong and ingrained approach to diversity and inclusion from a risk management perspective. We lump in those questions around D, E, and I, and the same things that we would do with risk assessments on projects. So it's become sort of an exercise to make sure we're including people so that we don't get in trouble. That's largely what I feel like the impulse is. But I feel like we're really missing a lot of exciting things when it comes to cultural transmission. It's not just nice to have. It's not a beautiful cultural mosaic whose only function is to be aesthetically pleasing. They're freaking useful tools. They're reminders, and that's what they are for me. They help you do your work, whatever it is, whether it's hunting, whether it's, hosting webinars, whether it's acting on stage. These stories, these unique mental models, these pieces of sophisticated social technologies, which allow us to center values and work more in, a dynamic and effective way, they're wonderful and they're enriching. And I think that the more that we can switch from a risk management perspective, or even just a superficial, aesthetic approach to diversity and inclusion and culture, and really just see the richness of everything that we can bring to these problems, it's going to be amazing. And it's going to justify why we need to have this diversity in the first place. Because once again, each one of us, we're bringing such unique perspectives to this question, to this larger conversation, and it's all useful. So that's kind of my hot take on this, building off of my dad's end.
It's a good take.
Yeah, I like how he thinks.
Good way.
I'll e-transfer you for saying that. Yeah.
So, Lewis, looking back, who are the most influential people in helping you learn your culture?
Well, first and foremost, I think the first teacher that I had was my mother. And I think mother plays such an important part to our growth and our first understanding of relationship and the depth of relationships that really nurture the soul and the identity of an individual. Then I'd have to turn to my father and say, yeah, he was very practical man, where he had skills and gifts and abilities that taught me how to be a better person in the things that I do. So one and the same are very important. And then, of course, the inspiration that I received from my grandfather and their generation, what they've contributed to the changes that I'm benefiting from today, falls in that kind of order. So, and then of course, I've been exposed to a number of Indigenous elders from not only from my own people or Indigenous elders from Alberta or Canada, but also around the world, and how much that we have in common, more in common than we do in difference. And it's through that really continues to reaffirm work that I do and reaffirm work that I think needs to be done. But it's kind of in that sort of order if we're going to be linear, but all of them really contribute to the inspiration of the work that I do.
Mm-hmm. So that takes me back to the center, actually. Is the center going to incorporate a lot of that vision you have?
Yes, we are. And what we're working on is developing pedagogical strategies that are based on Indigenous worldviews. And also cultural worldviews, because the Cree worldview isn't necessarily exactly the same way that the Blackfoot would look at things. But each of them are looking at that uniqueness of what our universe is and interpreting it through the lenses of their culture and their worldviews. So we know that when you start to establish teaching pedagogies that are based on these worldviews, in comparison with and alongside Western traditions of knowledge transfer, Indigenous students just do a lot better because they're more grounded in that familiarity of their cultural traditions. Mm-hmm. So we don't try to develop a one-size-fits-all Indigenous perspective on education or history, but what we do is we go to the elders of those nations and we ask them, how do you see this information being transferred to future generations of your people? So it has to be built on culture, because culture then informs the information, and vice versa. The information also then informs the culture as well, because of that shift and that change between generations. So they, again, going back to my other point, is that then those knowledge keepers become, they transfer the knowledge to other knowledge keepers, and then they add their perspectives to it as well, and then the tradition continues.
Mm-hmm. So in that context, how important is knowing the Cree language in terms of understanding Cree culture and having a conversation or having a relationship with other nations, other Indigenous nations? How important is the Cree language?
You happen to touch on my weakest point, and that is the fluidity of Cree. I did speak Cree when I was a young boy until we moved to the city here, and I remember learning how to speak English, which I found very awkward. It was like I had a marble in my mouth when I was trying to say words in English. But with the Indigenous words or the Indigenous language, it's a repository of knowledge. There is a saying, and I still don't know who to credit this with. Maybe I dreamt it up, or anyway, but we found it somewhere. And that is when the people have forgotten, the language remembers. And the reason why that is the case is because words and clauses and statements have a deep amount of history. So when you start to take them apart, when you start to really analyze the word, it's amazing what kind of knowledge comes out of those words. So the words aren't just describers of a situation, they're also holders of knowledge as well. And words really are knowledge keepers in that sense. So that's why language is really important, and the power of using those words in your discourse. And so it's a part of my own commitment to myself. I'm trying to reconnect with the power of that language once again, and continue to learn more.
But one thing that I think is important, and I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying, is just, you know, the ways in which we're viewing culture, I think, is so critical and important to ensure that we're engaging with it mindfully. A lot of the ways in which we inherently view culture is built off of highly problematic anthropological, like the methodologies that originated at a really problematic time, you know, classical, like scientific revolution, where we have this idea of what culture is a pure thing that we can trace back, and it looks like this, and it's based off of, you know, the amount of blood that someone has or the language that they have. And I think we really need to be careful about the ways in which we talk about language, we talk about culture, we talk about what it looks like to engage with culture, because, you know, we have a tendency to historicize, to diminish, to discriminate who is Cree enough. I'm sure all of us have all felt that way in some respects with the communities that we come from. So I think that it's really important to allow for there to be a vibrancy of the ways in which culture is expressed, as well as, you know, being mindful of the different levels of cultural enfranchisement that people have. You know, one of the most heartbreaking things that I've experienced is, you know, a very quick question, and it wasn't even said here, but you know, do you speak your language? Or even like, how often do you go back to the reserve? And it's just kind of like, oh, it's so complex, and I'm sure that no one means any harm by it, but, you know, it is really important to be mindful that, and once again, it goes back to the words that we're using in English when we're talking about culture, when we're talking about certain words, we're going to be relating to them differently. So the idea of culture from an Indigenous perspective is totally different from a Western perspective as well. So it's just so important to be so mindful of, you know, the multiple definitions of words that we're using, and be really clear with that, because it's just, I don't know, it's super, super tough, and it's super emotional and vulnerable too. Yeah, the nature of it.
So I just want to ask your permission to ask you a specific question. Okay, and it relates to what you're saying, Hunter, in relation to Cree history. We're just at the end of Black History Month, and this is a month that I do a lot of intensive research on the nations that occupied this land before settlers came and that kind of thing. So I just wanted to ask both of you if you have any difficulties in transferring the difficulties you describe in transferring your history, or if you only do it through storytelling, but there is so much history in the occupation, the presence on the lands here before others came, that I'm wondering if that's part of what is transferred from your dad to yourself going forward, you know, whether there's any appreciation of that history. Or, so that's the permission I'm asking, whether I can ask you a question like that, because I may misinterpret your history differently, you know, so, but it's a very important understanding I am trying to develop for myself about living on this land, you know. Yeah.
So I just want to make sure that I understand the question. I think it's brilliant, and I welcome like any question too. So please don't hesitate. So what I understand your question is there difficulty in transferring the specific historical knowledge of this place?
Yes.
Okay. You know, I think we do it in multiple ways. I mean, like my dad, like you love family history. I love specifically stories, not necessarily related to wars, but the economic history of Canada in relationship to Indigenous peoples is fascinating. But my mom, who, you know, is Polish, you know, she's a big foodie, and so am I. So I'm actually really fascinated in the the keystone species of the bison or the pemmican trade, or I'm also like kind of into military history. So for me, the early relationships between the Empire of England and the Cree up in James Bay is really fascinating to me. So I think that going back to the challenges of that is from a Western perspective, we have what's called the fetishization of the universal. Of there's one story. There isn't. There's multiple stories, and within those stories, there's multiple characters. So I think always reminding ourselves of that as much as possible can really help us freely move in a relational way of recognizing what we do and what we do not know. And I think that a major challenge is if we forget that, then we'll be in a really stressful situation of trying to find the right answer, and we'll never find it. So I think allowing there to be that freedom of exploration, that excitement as well. One of the things that my dad was really instrumental in me and is just encouraged me to continue to follow, what was most passionate for me. And because of that, I was able to see myself in what I was learning. And because of that, I was excited about it. And because of that, I was more likely to keep on learning about it. Even the whole language stuff. It's just I don't speak the language, but I also understand in some parts the worldviews embedded within that. So it's just, I don't know, it's really exciting. So I think always making it safe, warm, exciting has been the biggest, not challenge, but just constant practice. I'm not sure if you wanted to add anything there.
No.
Dad. Yeah.
Well, I think you said things extraordinarily well. And what really excites me about that is that while I can transfer, the memory of a knowledge or story to my son or to my children, if they take that and through their own lived experience and through their own searches of knowledge, they are adding to the depth of that story. So when we do come together, like he was talking about the pen and how he's looking at that pen, but I can't see what he's looking at until we sit together and we start to talk. And it may be the story of my grandfather and the traditions of trapping around the Lesser Slave Lake and hunting, and how that then ties directly into what he's looking at in terms of the history of economics and struggle. And then suddenly I'm finding that I'm learning something from my son because he's taken that and he's added to it, right?
And the challenge then becomes, how do we navigate a natural tendency, which once again, I'm sure comes up in so many different communities of gatekeepers, of folks who are like, no, I know the ultimate truth. And it's just one of the most powerful teachings that an elder recently gave to me, Elder Bob Cardinal, no relation, but probably some relation. He said, one of the biggest teachings was just am I missing something? Because one of his mentors was like, that was great. What you did, that ceremony was awesome, but you're missing something. And I had him go away and be like, oh, what was I missing? And what it did was it allowed him to once again do what he was doing with more mindfulness the next time, more attention to detail, so he didn't miss something. And it just it has you in a way of making sure that you're not thinking that you know everything as well. And I just think that, in so many different marginalized communities that have been oppressed for so long, there will be a tendency to protect the culture. And that can have its own consequences. And, I look at that with a lot of empathy, but, I've also been on the receiving end of lateral violence from elders who are just who gave you the right to do this? And it's just, could be just absolutely heartbreaking. So once again, and I think also one of the most important things that I've known or learned from my Muslim, your dad, is, we need to make sure we keep that symbolic flame of warmth and kindness at the core of our actions. Otherwise, our words and our actions are meaningless because they're cold.
That's right.
So that's been a really important guiding star for me, and I was so thankful to have that passed down. But that was through a YouTube video. So yeah, and
stories and history. I mean, history is a high story, right? And it carries with it all that valuable information that has been passed down to it. And again, going back to that, the symbol of the bundle and moving it forward, and then Hunter adding to it, reminded me of a story of an elder mentor of mine by the name of Dr. Joe Couture. Some of you may have known his name. He had shared a story with me about a very prominent indigenous medicine man in these parts when he was a young man, this medicine man, he remembers a person coming to his house and asking for his father to go with him to go see his father. So it was his grandfather. And so his father said, "Okay, son, come with me, and we'll go and see what my grandfather has to share with me." And the grandfather had been sharing traditional stories, songs, medicine traditions, ceremonies with his father. And so they gathered at his lodge, this old man's lodge. And so the old man said to him, "You know, son, I have given you all the stories that I know, and you know them well. And I've given you and taught you all the songs that you have shown me that you know very well. And the ceremonies that I know you now have them, and you do them all very well." He goes, "But there's one thing that I haven't given you, and I can't give you." And of course, his father asked him, he goes, what is that?" He said, "It's the songs, the ceremony, and of your time that you need to create to meet those challenges of that day." And so that's where that lineage of history and knowledge fits in, because when we oftentimes, in the way that I see things, oftentimes when we talk about history or culture, it appears to be fixed. We confuse tradition with a fixedness, but actually the constant in nature is change. And all we're doing is handing these tools to the next generation, because we know the world can be a very difficult and lonely place. But as Hunter was saying, we have to keep that warmth there for the next generation, because when you are facing the world on your own accord, and you may be struggling, it's these songs, it's these ceremonies, it's these stories that will keep you warm during the coldest part of that night of the soul, if you will.
It's that memory as well. Yes.
Yeah. So then you're not alone, right?
Yes.
And you actually have something to work with.
But if I can just add something, and I hope it doesn't make anything too complicated, but like, to once again expand this idea of the words that we're using, I had a great conversation with a mentor of mine. We were having dinner, and I was just like, I'm really worried about, the stories that exist and the teachings that are with them, and I'm scared we're going to lose them. And I want to help, but I don't know how. And this is me coming from an actor's perspective, and like, I want to be able to tell the stories, and I don't often. Sometimes I feel like I'm not doing enough, right? And he just said, like, we can never lose these stories because they're alive. They're animate. They're spirits in a way. We just need to make sure that we're listening, so that we can help them do their work, so that they can bring medicine to where they need to bring it, to who they need to bring it. So I think that that's a really interesting idea, because it shifts this conversation from not just things, but responsibilities that we have to not only ourselves, but the story and the important ideas that are within those stories, and making sure that we as storytellers are doing our best through being honest with ourselves and what we see within that story and what we hear, so that we can make sure that that spirit can do the work that it needs to do. And we'll have stories and those spirits, never be forgotten, because they can leave, they can go heal, they can do other things, but they'll always find a way to come back. And I remember, Dad, you were telling me, that even in some sweat lodges, that some elders will be like, oh, like that's actually an old song, and the person was just like, I was just making it up. So so I always find that to be really interesting too, because it's like, it's not just stories, it's not just culture, it's like responsibility and something that's alive and animate. So we're actually having a quite profound conversation. And
one of the teachings that came along with that, and I shared this with you, Hunter, is an elder was sharing with me at some conference, one of the millions of conferences I went to. Anyway, this elder was saying, I am sick and tired of people always telling me that we're losing culture. We're losing culture. And he said, in fact, what I know to be true is that we haven't lost culture. Culture has lost us. And once we go back to the simplest of our ceremony and we reconnect with that great mystery or the spirits that are associated with our stories and our cultures, they start to come back. And the point that Hunter was making is that we see with younger generations now that they're starting to sing songs that they think they're just making up. And some of the elders are saying, hold it, my great grandfather sang that song. You know, so it kind of sends chills up your spine and you go, yeah, all right, okay, that's true.
It's once you open the door, it comes back in.
Yes.
Yeah.
So to what extent does the majority culture hinder passing on your culture? And how do you overcome that?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the question. Can you say that again, please?
Oh, yes, of course. To what extent does the majority culture hinder passing on your culture? And
Well,
how do you overcome that?
Well, I mean, like when you're trying to reconnect with culture and history and those sorts of things, I think the Western society, the way it's been for Indigenous people, has been always hiding or obfuscating our knowledge and our traditions. They haven't placed any value on it, so therefore, why should it be remembered? And when you're working from a colonial mentality, the whole idea is trying to get you to assimilate into that particular worldview and knowledge base by not creating that space or opportunity for you to take a look at your history with your own cultural lenses. So it's always that's been the challenge. But I think in my father's generation, particularly, it was the effort of trying to remove the political barriers that made changes to the political system, where we can start to run our own schools and include our own stories into the teaching traditions and bringing those stories back into the community without being afraid to do so. So my son's generation then are the ones who are going to be bringing back those stories, I believe, in a greater way than perhaps what we've known through my generation or even my father's generation. But it certainly is something that I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, and you know, I mean, that's a huge responsibility, and I hear that, and I kind of like, you know, I have a panic attack. But anyways,
You have a panic attack?
oh, absolutely, yeah. No, yeah, my legs are going crazy down there. But one of the things that I wanted to say too, just in terms of very specific things, because I thought that was a really important high level question. I think one of the things that I'd be interested in was like, stop making it hard to be alive, you know? Like one of the hardest things is like, you have to work a job to pay rent, to buy food, you know, there's certain barriers that it's really untenable to be a human lately. So I feel like one of the best things that can be done for folks to truly thrive is for them to have the materials and the resources to do that. You know, whether that's, you know, creative partnerships or demonetizing what it is to live, you know, so that we have food, so that we're not constantly in a mind of scarcity, so that we have time to rest, to connect, to celebrate, to be in relationship with one another. I think that's going to be really important. I'm really excited around conversations like universal basic income, or even finding, you know, creative ways where we're not constantly in a cycle of working all the time. You know, so I think that, you know, that's going to be really, really crucial. And without that, it's so difficult to have your culture and to be able to fully engage with it, because otherwise that scarcity mindset's going to really, and you know, this was my experience too, as an actor before I started doing this work. It was so hard to really meaningfully engage with the culture because there's literally no time. You know, you can't just stop a theater production because you need to go to the bush for, you know, it doesn't even have to be anything important. You can't even go for funerals because, you know, you need to be able to do the show the next day. So it's brutal. But I really think that if we can explore the ways that we can just have people live, then we'll be able to transmit the culture and add to it and grow it as well.
Well, it goes back to the work that I'm doing and developing the first urban indigenous ceremonial and cultural land base, because right now we're the only people who have to leave the city to practice our culture and our traditions. So now with the work that we've been doing over the last 15 years to press this issue with the city is so that now we can have the next generations have access to cultural resources, elders, ceremonies, all these different sorts of things, so that they can start to ground themselves in the power of their cultural identity and hence their story.
Yeah, and like it's not just, once again, a nice to have. Like if you have people who are fully vitalized, the ways in which they'll be able to contribute to other communities, it's going to be huge. Like I feel like, for the most part, a lot of people are kind of operating with like the efficiency of like, if they have a 6-cylinder engine, I don't know cars, but it's just like we're operating with just one cylinder, and if we're really grounded and feeling secure and feeling connected and like we matter, then it's like, all 6 cylinders. And that's when some really good stuff's going to happen.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I hear you. Hi.
Hi.
So I want to bring us back around to, well, one of the goals of the project is, and this is a question for both of you, do you have any thoughts on how parents and grandparents can connect with their grandchildren to convey the culture and cultural identity?
Oh, wow. Hunter, do you want to challenge that one first?
Yeah, totally. I think freaking make it as easy as possible. Make it as easy and as simple as possible. If it's just getting kids excited about, language, stories, food, find out what they're interested in, find out what you're interested in too, and go on an adventure together. Create a project, see how it goes. I think that's going to be really important. But I think the most important thing is that you make that journey sustainable. It's really, we can put a lot of pressures on ourselves. So I think the more that we can be gentle, the more that we can be warm and really trust that this is an ongoing process, and lead with love and warmth. I think that, it doesn't matter what it ends up looking like, but, my dad and I, we love road trips. We used to go, like, one of the most like important teachings that I've learned has been like literally my dad sharing stories and me looking out the window. Like, and I love that about it now. And now it's exciting because I think of road trips as being a wonderful opportunity to learn more about, our family and stuff like that. So I think that's great. We're also like huge nerds about treaty history. We're both fascinated by family history and stuff like that. So just finding those natural pockets of, yeah, I love this. And then just making that easy. Like my dad and I are starting to have a lot more like dinners together now where we're talking about this kind of stuff. And that's super great and super wonderful for so many reasons. But just like being unromantic with how it looks, I think is going to be really helpful.
Who does the cooking?
Oh, both of us.
Oh, cool.
Well, I would say that if the question was who's the better cook, it would be Hunter.
Nonsense. No, we share the responsibility and we love it. So it's
that's cool.
also movies too. Anyways, but yeah, I just think as easy as possible, as unromantic as possible, and as most specifically aligned with who you are and what interests both of you. Or both.
And I think you've touched on this, Hunter, as well, and that is making parents and the children accessible to each other. Because when we're chasing our tails to pay the rent and the insurance and all this other sort of stuff, we come home at the end of a very long day, and a lot of parents are just really tired. And it's not only just one job. Sometimes it's 2 or 3 jobs just to make ends meet. Where are the children going to get reinforcement of their identity and culture and traditions and knowledge if they can't see their parents? So with the younger kids from ages 0 to 5, they're pretty much being left in the hands of strangers that we pay to look after our children. When really during those crucial times, we know, psychology teaches us that, the first 5 years of a child's life, they try to, work towards undoing for the rest of their life. But, and the opposite is true. So if you have that positive connection, that doesn't have to be, extraordinarily complex, but just that opportunity to hang together and to share stories, naturally there will be a connectivity that starts to happen. And the child feels grounded and connected to not only their parents, but to the story of their family and the story of their culture.
Mhm. Wow. May I ask Crystal and Earl if there's anything else we'd like to extract from Hunter and Lewis?
Like that. Yeah.
Yes.
This was wonderful. This was an honor and a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Lewis and Hunter.
Well, thank you all for the wonderful job that you're doing.
Your answer is really inspiring. I really like that you guys share stories. You guys mentioned how words aren't just characters, and that the characters have history and culture and like meanings behind it. And I totally agree with that. And then when we tell the stories, it's not just like, you know, a jumble of words that you're sharing with other people. It's kind of like you're sharing your own experiences and your own perspectives as well. And I quite like that.
Mhm.
Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, before I release both of you, I wanted to let you know how much personally this interview has meant to me. There is a lot of transference between our cultures that I recognize. If you come to my house now, you'll get bannock in my kitchen because I make that every week. We call it something else in my culture, but it's the same, you know. So there's a lot of transference that I have enjoyed personally in my life, and really appreciate the opportunity to thrive in this environment that you've given us the permission to do. And we thank you so much for that. And we look forward to continuing to learn from you, from both of you, as we go forward. So thank you so much for allowing us to do this interview with you. It's been a learning experience and a sharing experience, and we really appreciate that, the openness with which you've approached it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wish you well.
Hi.
Let me know